In the first hour after midnight on the 21st of August 1942, nearly 900 Japanese soldiers emerged from the sandgrass on the eastern bank of a shallow tidal creek on Guadalcanal, charging and screaming toward a line of entrenched Marines. Their leader, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, had assured his troops that this engagement would be brief. He held the belief that American Marines were undisciplined and soft, the products of a democracy too comfortable to endure the kind of combat Japanese soldiers had been prepared for since their youth. He had analyzed their landing and their gear, concluding that a single, resolute night attack would shatter them, much like the colonial garrisons across Asia had crumbled since the conflict began. However, by daybreak, more than 800 of his soldiers lay dead on the sandbar and in the water. Only a little more than a dozen permitted themselves to be captured, marking some of the first Japanese soldiers of the entire war, willing to become prisoners in any significant number. Ichiki did not survive to clarify what had failed. Weeks later, another Japanese general arrived on the same island to attempt another assault with a much larger force. After his own offensive collapsed against a ridge south of the American airfield, he penned a line that the imperial headquarters in Tokyo desperately tried and failed to suppress. Guadalcanal, wrote General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was no longer just the name of an island in Japanese military history. It had become, in his own words, the graveyard of the Japanese army. That was the initial realization, but it would not be the last. Over the following 3 years, across a chain of islands that most people today would have difficulty locating on a map, Japanese officers, trained since adolescence to view death in battle as a form of victory, continually encountered an enemy that acted in ways their own doctrine claimed was impossible. This is not merely a tale of American Marines fighting with bravery, as every military in that war produced acts of courage. This is a story about 7 specific observations, each documented by the Japanese officers who witnessed them, that should not have been true according to everything those officers had been taught, yet were true nonetheless. To comprehend why each realization hit so hard, it is useful to understand what Japanese military academies actually instructed in the years leading up to the war. The doctrine held that democracies produced comfortable citizens, and comfortable citizens did not wish to die for a collection of coral atolls that no one back home had ever heard of. The theory was that if you inflicted enough pain quickly enough, the United States would sue for terms rather than continue paying in blood for real estate that had no value beyond an airstrip. This was not just prejudice disguised as strategy, though prejudice was certainly a factor. It was a specific foundational assumption repeated in staff colleges from Tokyo to occupied Manchuria, and Guadalcanal was where it first began to crack. What followed shattered that assumption 7 more times in 7 distinct ways, each leaving its own paper trail in the handwriting of the men who were defeated. On the night of October 24, 1942, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama tested that logic directly. His Sendai division had spent 2 weeks dragging artillery pieces through jungles so thick that pack mules could not follow along the path. Japanese maps optimistically called the Maruyama Trail. By the time roughly 3,000 of his men reached the American lines south of Henderson Field, they had lost most of their heavy weaponry and a significant portion of their strength simply to the environment. Maruyama ordered them forward anyway, confident that sheer numbers would complete what the march had begun. At the center of the American lines were 2 machine gun sections from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, led by a 25-year-old sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, named John Basilone. When the guns on his flank went silent because their crews were killed or wounded, Basilone left his own position under fire, reached the abandoned gun, and operated alone until reinforcements arrived. When ammunition became scarce, he carried it forward himself under fire rather than waiting for it to be delivered. Waves of Japanese infantry struck that section of the line for the better part of 2 days. They continued to charge even after the sound alone should have signaled to any rational officer that the position could not be taken by simply adding more bodies to the pile. By the time the assault broke, nearly 3,000 of Maruyama's soldiers were dead or dying in front of a line held, at its most desperate hour, by little more than 2 machine guns and the sergeant who refused to let either stop firing. A surviving officer of the Sendai Division, in an account collected after the campaign, described the combat in 6 words that circulated through Japanese staff briefings for the remainder of the war. "We attacked and they did not run." It read like a simple observation, but to everyone who received it, it read like a dire warning. The second observation followed the first, though it took the Japanese command longer to accept because it initially appeared to be a weakness rather than a strength. American forces would risk healthy men and lose some of them to rescue wounded ones repeatedly, even when the rescue offered no tactical advantage at all. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood this before he ever set foot on Iwo Jima. Years before the war, he had served as a military attaché in Washington, touring American Army posts and receiving, from an officer he befriended there, a silver revolver that he carried for the rest of his life. In a letter home to his wife, Yoshi, written before the first American landing craft ever appeared off his island, he recorded an observation that shaped his entire defensive strategy. "Americans," he told her, "have always taken casualties very seriously." He meant this as intelligence, not as a sentiment. If an enemy would not abandon its wounded, that enemy could be made to bleed for every yard of volcanic sand, rather than leave men behind to die alone. He was correct, and Japanese riflemen had already witnessed this 2 years earlier on the coral ridges above the invasion beaches of Peleliu. Naval bombardment had barely damaged the caves carved into those ridges, and from within them, Japanese defenders watched American Navy corpsmen crawl forward, carrying no weapons of their own, only morphine and bandages to reach Marines who had fallen in open ground. Some corpsmen were hit doing this more than once in a single afternoon and went back out regardless. A Japanese medical officer captured near the end of the battle told his interrogators that his own service held no equivalent principle. A soldier who could no longer fight, he said, had no further value worth risking a healthy man to preserve. He remarked that he had never seen a doctrine contradict his own so completely or cost the enemy so much to maintain. The third thing was less about bravery than about arithmetic. And arithmetic frightened Japanese planners more than almost anything else because arithmetic cannot be defeated in combat. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the garrison on Baityo, the main island of the Tarawa Atoll, and he had genuine reason for confidence. His engineers, along with more than 1,000 conscripted laborers, had spent nearly a year turning a sandbar smaller than New York's Central Park into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground in the entire Pacific. 14 coastal guns, hundreds of machine gun positions, and bunkers with walls thick enough to withstand naval shells covered every approach to the beach. Shibasaki told his men that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The assault began on November 20th, 1943, and the tide was against the attackers before the first shot was even fired. Low water left the coral reef surrounding Baityo exposed at exactly the wrong depth. Too shallow for landing craft, yet too deep to simply walk. Marines climbed out of stalled boats several hundred yards from the shore and waded in, chest deep, rifles held overhead, into machine gun fire crossing the lagoon from 3 directions at once. Men went under and did not come back up, dragged down by packs they had no time to shed. Survivors would later call that stretch of open water, measured afterward at nearly 500 meters, simply the long walk in. It took not 100 years but 76 hours and not 1,000,000 men, but 18,000. Shibasaki himself was killed on the first afternoon. When the fighting concluded, only 17 of his roughly 4,500 defenders remained alive to surrender. What unsettled the Japanese command was not that the boast had failed, but what the failure revealed about a deeper miscalculation. Japan's wartime economy was, by most estimates, smaller than 1/6 the size of America's. Every carrier, every trained pilot, and every seasoned infantry regiment Japan lost was gone for good, and everyone in the Japanese high command knew it. The United States treated its own losses as a production problem to be solved. Sink one carrier, and a newer one arrived within the year. Kill the pilots of one air group, and their replacements arrived with more flight hours, logged in training than most surviving Japanese aviators had left by 1944. A staff officer with the Imperial Navy's combined fleet later wrote that his own service began the war unable to imagine an enemy who could outproduce every casualty inflicted upon it, and finished the war unable to imagine anything else. Between Kawaguchi's graveyard and Shibasaki's arithmetic sat the same discovery, reached independently, years apart, by men who never met each other. The fourth thing struck at something Japanese officers considered nearly sacred. The belief that an army's fighting spirit flowed downward from its commanders. Kill the officer, doctrine held, and the men beneath him would lose direction and soon after lose the will to continue. It was not an unreasonable theory. It described how most conscript armies in history, including large parts of Japan's own, actually behaved. It did not, however, describe Marine rifle squads on Iwo Jima's black volcanic slopes in February of 1945. American infantry training assumed officers would die, assumed radios would fail, and assumed a private first class might become the senior man alive on a stretch of beach with no orders coming from anyone. Every Marine, not just those wearing rank insignia, was trained to know the objective and keep moving toward it regardless of who remained standing to give the order. Entire platoons lost every officer and senior sergeant within the first hour of the landing and continued their assault under corporals, sometimes under privates, without any pause that a Japanese observer on the ridgeline above could detect. A company commander of the Japanese Army's 26th Tank Regiment dug into a fortified position above one invasion beach, watched a single such platoon through binoculars for most of an afternoon. In notes recovered from his position after the battle, he wrote that he had killed the platoon's officer and both of its ranking sergeants within the assault's opening minutes, then watched the same platoon continue forward within minutes, reorganized as though rank meant nothing to them at all. He noted that his own soldiers had been trained their entire military lives to consider such a thing structurally impossible. An army without functioning command, Japanese doctrine insisted, was not an army, but a mob that happened to be moving in one direction. What he watched through his binoculars that afternoon was neither a mob nor, by any definition his training gave him, an army that should still have been fighting. This was not an accident of individual grit. It was the direct product of a training philosophy the Marine Corps had built deliberately in the years before the war. One that pushed tactical decision-making as far down the chain of command as it could go, on the theory that a rifle squad waiting for permission from an officer 3 ranks removed would already be dead by the time permission arrived. Japanese infantry training, by contrast, concentrated initiative almost entirely in commissioned officers, which made Japanese units formidable for as long as those officers survived, and brittle in the exact moment they did not. The fifth thing contradicted everything Japanese civilians on Okinawa had been told to expect, and history has done less to remember it than almost anything else on this list. Through the spring of 1945, Japanese military authorities on Okinawa circulated a specific message among the island's civilian population. American Marines, villagers were told, tortured prisoners and murdered captured islanders without exception, and surrender was framed as a fate worse than death. In the caves of southern Okinawa, that message produced mass suicides among terrified families who believed they had no other choice, and some Japanese soldiers sheltering in those same caves handed civilians grenades to make certain of it. What civilians who did emerge from those caves found, in case after documented case, was Marines who fed them, treated their wounds, and, in a number of recorded incidents, physically pulled people back from cliff edges to stop suicides already underway. A Japanese military policeman assigned to civil affairs on the island later admitted that the gap between what he had told villagers to expect and what he personally watched American troops do had shaken something in him that survived the war intact. He said the propaganda he had helped distribute described an enemy he did not recognize once he saw that enemy behave. None of this erases what did happen elsewhere in the Pacific on both sides, because atrocities occurred in this war, and no honest account pretends otherwise. But the specific claim that surrender to Marines meant certain death was, according to the very officials whose job had been to spread that claim, demonstrably false. And some of them said so once nobody could punish them for it. The sixth thing lived inside men's heads rather than in after-action reports, which made it harder to document. But Japanese officers wrote about it anyway, because it unsettled them enough to try. Japanese doctrine assumed that soldiers fighting for a democracy, drafted out of peacetime civilian life, rather than raised from childhood to consider death in the emperor's service a form of honor, would fight with less total commitment. What Japanese officers observed instead, island after island, was a different kind of commitment entirely, aimed sideways rather than upward. American Marines did not appear to fight primarily for Washington or for an abstraction called the flag. They fought for the 3 or 4 men beside them, and that loyalty proved in practice at least as unbreakable as anything built on ideology. None of this required the men doing it to feel brave in any way they would have recognized as bravery. Survivors who wrote about combat afterward almost never described courage as an emotion. They described a kind of narrowing, a tunnel in which the war outside their own fire team briefly ceased to exist, and the only fact left standing was that the man on their left had just gone down, and somebody needed to reach him. Nobody demonstrated this more completely than the same sergeant who had held the line south of Henderson Field. Basilone came home to a hero's welcome, a Medal of Honor ceremony, and an offer that would have kept him safely on American soil, selling war bonds for the rest of the war. He turned it down, asked repeatedly to return to a combat unit, and eventually the Marine Corps let him. He landed with the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima's Black Sand on February 19, 1945, destroyed a Japanese blockhouse that had pinned down his company, and led several men across open ground under fire to reach a stranded tank crew. A mortar round killed him within the hour. He had traded a safe war for a dangerous one to stay with men he had trained, and the Japanese defenders on that stretch of beach never learned his name. They knew only that the American assault in front of them once again did not stop when it should have. The 7th thing was the one Japanese commanders genuinely believed would work, because on paper it should have. If frontal beach defense and suicidal mass charges kept failing against American firepower, the answer was to stop fighting on the beach at all. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, defending Peleliu beginning in September of 1944, abandoned the shoreline almost entirely and built his defense inland into the coral ridges of the Umabrogo Massif. More than 500 caves and tunnels, interconnected and nearly invisible from the air, let his men fire from hidden angles and vanish before naval gunfire could find them. American commanders had predicted the island would fall in 4 days. It took more than 2 months, and the Marine Corps' own official history still lists Peleliu among the costliest battles, measured by casualties per man engaged, that the Corps ever fought. Nakagawa's honeycomb should have held far longer than it did. It did not, because the same force that could not be stopped by machine guns on Guadalcanal adapted faster than his doctrine accounted for. Marine engineers began sealing cave mouths with explosives and flamethrowers, rather than assaulting them directly. Tanks fitted with flame projectors burned defenders out of positions rifle fire could never reach. Combat teams learned to isolate one cave system at a time, cut its water and ammunition, and simply wait. It was slower than Nakagawa had feared and more total than he had planned for. On the 24th of November, 10 weeks into a battle his own headquarters had expected to end within days, Nakagawa sent a final message north. "Our sword is broken," he wrote, "and we have run out of spears." He burned his regimental colors and took his own life rather than his surrender. The tactics born on Peleliu's ridges were refined and used again within months on Iwo Jima, then a 3rd time on Okinawa. Each time, Japanese defenders built positions meant to make American victory unbearably expensive. Each time the cost was real and fully paid, and the positions still fell. General Kurabayashi never saw the war end. He had forbidden the suicidal mass charges that wasted lives on other islands, insisting instead that every soldier's duty was to survive long enough to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. It was a grim arithmetic meant to make Iwo Jima's capture as expensive as one island could be made. He held it for 36 days against a force that had expected to secure it inside a week, then led a final assault himself in the closing days of March 1945, the exact date still disputed by historians. His body was never recovered. In an earlier letter home, he had told his wife not to look for him among the dead, because there might be nothing left worth finding. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese soldiers who defended Iwo Jima under his command, only a few hundred were still alive to be taken prisoner when the fighting finally stopped. The men who wrote these reports and these final messages were not propagandists inflating an enemy to excuse their own defeat. Most wrote for superiors who did not want to hear it, or for wives who would read the words only after the war was over, or for nobody at all except the record. Ichiki, Kawaguchi, Kuribayashi, Shibasaki, Nakagawa, and dozens of officers whose names did not survive the paperwork all reached variations of the same conclusion independently, on different islands in different years, without ever coordinating with one another. The enemy they had been trained to expect, soft and unwilling to pay a serious price, did not exist. In its place was something their doctrine had no real vocabulary for: an army built from drafted civilians that fought with the persistence of fanatics while still finding time to carry wounded strangers and occasionally wounded enemies out of the line of fire. Popular memory of the Second World War in the Pacific has, for the most part, moved on from these particular islands. The war in Europe produced Normandy and a library of films built around it. The Pacific produced one photograph of a flag raised on a mountain called Suribachi that almost everyone recognizes, and comparatively little else that most people could name. But the men who were actually there, on the side that lost, left behind a paper trail that says otherwise again and again in their own handwriting, describing an enemy they refused to believe in until the evidence made refusal impossible. Return for a moment to that riverbank in the dark hours of August 1942, to the men who believed the Marines in front of them would break the way other Western armies had broken across Asia since the war began. They were wrong within a single night, and the men who survived to write about it spent the next 3 years discovering exactly how wrong, one island at a time. Not because American Marines were supermen, immune to fear or pain, or the ordinary human instinct to survive. They were none of those things. They were frightened young men who kept fighting anyway, who carried their wounded under fire for no tactical reason beyond the fact that they would not leave them, who kept attacking after their officers were dead because nobody had ever told them that was a reason to stop. The Japanese officers who documented all of this were not building a myth. They were trying to explain to their own commanders and to themselves why an enemy their training said should have quit kept refusing to. 7 times in 7 different ways on 7 different islands, the answer they wrote down amounted to the same uncomfortable conclusion. It was not that the Marines fought without fear. It was that whatever they were afraid of mattered to them less than the man standing beside them. And that turned out to be the one thing no Japanese war college ever taught its officers how to defeat. If this exploration of the hidden records of the Pacific War has changed how you view the resilience of the human spirit in the face of impossible odds, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history that time tried to bury. Join us as we plant the seeds for a deeper understanding of our past. The next treasury of historical truth will be opened soon.